Okay, Hannah and I are reading Hinds on High Places by Hannah Hernard. Weeping may endure for a night. Psalm 30 verse 5. O thou afflicted, tossed with tempests, and not comforted, behold, I will lay thy stones with fair colours, and lay thy foundations with sapphires. I will make thy windows of agates, and thy gates of carbuncles, and all thy borders of pleasant stones. Isaiah 54 verse 11 to 12. An invitation to high places. This is the story of how Much Afraid escaped from her fearing relatives and went with Shepherd to the high places where perfect love casteth out fear. For several years Much Afraid had been in the service of the chief shepherd, whose great flocks were pastured down in the valley of humiliation. She lived with her friends and fellow workers Mercy and Peace in a tranquil little white cottage in a village with much trembling. She loved her work and desired intensely to please the chief shepherd, but happy as she was in most ways, she was conscious of simple things which hindered her in her work and caused her much secret distress and shame.
Go a bit louder.
So loud.
Loud here. I'm not sure if I'll hear you.
She was a cripple, with feet so crooked that they often caused her to limp and stumble as she went about her work. She had also a very unsightly blemish of a crooked mouth, which greatly disfigured both expression and speech, and was sadly conscious that these ugly blemishes must be a cause of astonishment and offence to many who knew that she was in the service of the great shepherd. Most earnestly she longed to be completely delivered from these shortcomings, and to be made beautiful, gracious, and strong, as were so many of the shepherds, other workers, and above all to be made like the chief shepherd himself. But she feared that there could be no deliverance from these two crippling disfigurements, and that they must continue to mar her service always. There was, however, another and even greater trouble in her life. She was a member of the family of Fearings, and her relatives were scattered all over the valley, so that she could never really escape from them. An orphan, she had been brought up in the home of her aunt, poor Mrs. Dismal Forebodings, with her two cousins, gloomy and spiteful, and their brother, craven of fear, a great bully who habitually tormented and persecuted her in a really dreadful way. Like most of the other families who lived in the Valley of Humiliation, all the Fearings hated the chief shepherd and tried to boycott his servants, and naturally it was a great offence to them that one of their own family should have entered his service. Consequently, they did all they could, both by threats and persuasions, to get her out of his employment, and one the family dictated that she must immediately marry one of her own people. She refused to do this of her own free will. They threatened to use force and compel her. Poor Much Afraid was of course overwhelmed with horror at the mere idea, but her relatives always horrified. She was never learned to resist or ignore their threats, so she simply sat cowering before them, repeating again and again that nothing would induce her to marry Craven Fear, but quite unable to escape from their presence. The unhappy interview, therefore, lasted a long time, and when they finally did leave for her a little, it was already early evening. With a surge of relief, Much Afraid remembered that the chief shepherd would then be leading his flocks to their accustomed watering place beside a lovely cascade and pool on the outskirts of the village. To this place she was in the habit of going very early in the morning to meet him and learn his wishes and commands for the day, and again in the evenings to give her a report on the day's work. It was now time to meet him here beside the pool, and she felt sure he would help her and not permit her relatives to kidnap her and force her to leave his service for the dreadful slavery of marriage with Craven Fear. Still shaking with fear, and without pausing to wash the tears from her face, Much Afraid shut the door of the cottage and started off for the cascade and the pool. The quiet evening light was filling the Valley of Humiliation with a golden glow, and she left the village and started to cross the fields. Beyond the river, the mountains which bounded the eastern side of the valley, like towering ramparts, were already tinged with pink, and their deep gorges were filled with lovely and mysterious shadows. Through the quiet and peace of this tranquil evening, poor Much Afraid came to the pool where the shepherd was waiting for her, and told him of her dreadful plight. "What shall I do?" she cried, as she ended the recital. "How can I escape? They can't really force me to marry my cousin Craven, can they? Oh," cried she, overwhelmed again at the very thought of such a prospect. "It is a dreadful thought to be much afraid, and to think of having to be Mrs. Craven for the rest of my life, and never able to escape from the torment of it is more than I can bear." "Don't be afraid," said the shepherd gently. "You are in my service, and if you will trust me, they will not be able to force you against your will into any family alliance. But you ought never to have let your fearing relatives into your cottage, because they are enemies of the king who is taking you into his employment." "I know," cried Much Afraid, "but whenever I meet any of my relatives, I seem to lose all my strength, and simply cannot resist them, no matter how I strive. As long as I live in the valley, I cannot escape meeting them. They are everywhere, and now that they are determined to get me into their power again, I shall never dare venture outside my cottage alone for fear of being kidnapped." As she spoke, she lifted her eyes and looked across the valley and the river to the lovely sunset-lighted peaks of the mountains, then cried out in a desperate longing, "Oh, if only I could escape from this valley of humiliation altogether and go to the high places, completely out of reach of all the feelings and my other relatives." No sooner were these words uttered when, in complete astonishment, the shepherd answered, "I have waited a long time to hear you make that suggestion, Much Afraid. It would indeed be best for you to leave the valley for the high places, and I will very willingly take you there myself. The lower slopes of those mountains on the other side of the river are the borderland of my father's kingdom, the realm of love. No fears of any kind are able to live there, because perfect love casteth out fear and everything that torments." Much Afraid stared at him in amazement. "Go to the high places," she exclaimed, "and live there? Oh, if only I could! For months past the longing hath never left me. I think of it day and night. But is it not possible? I could never get there. I'm too late." She looked down at the well-formed feet as she spoke, and her eyes again filled with fear and tears of despair and self-pity. "The mountains are too steep and dangerous. I have been told that only hinds and deer can move on them safely." "It is quite true that the way up to the high places is both difficult and dangerous," said the shepherd. "It has to be, so that nothing which is an enemy of love can make the ascent and invade the kingdom. Nothing blemished or in any way imperfect is allowed there, and the inhabitants of the high places do need hinds' feet. I have them myself," he said with a smile, "and like a young hart or a roebuck I can go leaping on the mountains and skipping on the hills with the greatest ease and pleasure. But Much Afraid, I could make yours like hinds' feet also, and set you upon the high places. You could serve me then much more fully, and be out of reach of all your enemies. I am delighted to hear that you have been longing to go there, for as I said before, I have been waiting for you to make that suggestion." Then he added with another smile, "You would never have to meet Craven Fear again." Much Afraid stared at him in bewilderment. "Make my feet like hinds' feet," she repeated. "How is that possible? And what would the inhabitants of the kingdom of love say to the presence of such a wretched little cripple with an ugly face and a twisted mouth, if nothing blemished and imperfect may dwell there?" "It is true," said the shepherd, "that you would have to be changed before you could live on the high places. But if you are willing to go with me, I promise to help you develop hinds' feet. up there on the mountains, as you get near the real high places, the air is fresh and invigorating. It strengthens the whole body, and there are streams with wonderful healing properties, so that those who bathe in them find all their blemishes and disfigurements washed away. But there's another thing I must tell you. Not only would I have to make your feet like hinds' feet, but you would have to receive another name, for it would be impossible for Much Afraid to enter the kingdom of love, as for any other member of the fearing family. Are you willing to be changed completely, Much Afraid, and to be made like a new name, which you will receive if you become a citizen of the kingdom of love? She nodded her head, and then said very earnestly, "Yes, I am." Again he smiled, but added gravely, "There is still one thing more, the most important of all. No one is allowed to dwell in the kingdom of love unless they have the flower of love already blooming in their hearts. Has love been planted in your heart, Much Afraid?" As the shepherd said this, he looked at her very steadily, and she realized that his eyes were searching into the very depths of her heart, and knew all that there was far better than she did herself. She did not answer for a long time, because she was not sure what to say, but she looked rather flinchingly into his eyes, which were gazing so penetratingly, and became aware that they had the power of reflecting what they looked upon. She could thus really see her own heart as he saw it. So after a long pause she answered, "I think that what is growing there is a great longing to experience the joy of natural human love, but to learn the love supremely one person who will love me in return. But perhaps that desire, natural and right as it seems, is not the love of which she is thinking." She paused, and then added honestly and almost tremblingly, "I see the longing to be loved and admired growing in my heart, shepherd. But I don't think I see the kind of love that you're talking about, at least nothing like the love which I see in you." "Then will you let me plant the seed of true love there now?" asked the shepherd. "It will take you some time to develop hinds' feet and to climb the high places. Then if I put the seed in your heart now, it will be ready to bloom by the time you get there." Much Afraid shrank back. "I'm afraid," she said. "I've been told that if you really love someone, you give that loved one the power to hurt and pain you in a way nothing else can." "That is true," agreed the shepherd. "To love does mean to put yourself into the power of the loved one, and to become very vulnerable to pain. And you are much afraid of pain, are you not?" She nodded miserably, and then said shamefacedly, "Yes, very much afraid of it." "But it is so happy to love," said the shepherd quietly. "It is happy to love, even if you are not loved in return. There is much pain too, certainly, but love does not think that very significant." Much Afraid thought suddenly that he had the most patient eyes she had ever seen. At the same time, there was something in them that hurt her to the heart, though she could not have said why, but she still shrank back in fear and said, bringing the words out very quickly, because somehow she was ashamed to say them, "I would never dare to love unless I was sure of being